My name is Kelly Bedard, and I'm the current chair of the Department of Economics. And I just want to thank the students and the faculty, and I think I saw Dean Roop sneak in at the back, and community members and friends of the department for coming today. To remind you, the Carl Snyder Lecture is, of course, in honor of Carl Snyder. Carl Snyder was born in Cedar Falls, Iowa in 1869. He attended the University of Iowa and attended lectures in Paris, but he was really a self-taught individual. By the age of 20, he was the editor of a local Iowa newspaper and eventually was an editorial writer for the Washington Post. He was president of the American Statistical Association, a fellow of the American Association for Advancement of Science, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and a member of the International Institute of Statistics. He was also a statistician for the Federal Reserve Bank, and he lectured at many universities in the United States and contributed to many economics journals. He passed away in 1946. The Carl Snyder Memorial Lecture was established in 1960 with a bequest from the estate of his wife, Madeline Reich. The memorial is used to bring an outstanding economist to UC Santa Barbara every year for a public lecture. To honor Carl Snyder, a group of alumni, faculty, and friends of the department collaborate every year to identify a distinguished speaker, and we are pleased to have Raj Chetty here this year. So let me tell you a little bit about Raj. Raj Chetty is a professor of economics at Stanford. His research combines empirical evidence and economic theory to help design more effective government policies. His work on tax policy, unemployment insurance, and education has been widely cited in the media and has been part of congressional testimony on many occasions. Professor Chetty is a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Award and the John Bates Clark Award, which is given every year to an outstanding economist under the age of 40. I have to say that Raj had a little bit of an advantage over his competitors on this since he finished his PhD at the age of 23, so he had a little more time than some. He began his career at Berkeley and then returned to Harvard in, I think it was 2009, and was one of the youngest tenured faculty at Harvard at the time. And then in 2015, he realized that the West Coast was a better place to be, and he came back to Stanford. Today, we are honored to have Professor Chetty talk about the ways we might improve economic opportunities for children growing up in low-income households. Professor Chetty's work on this topic has been extremely influential. The questions and answers he will share with us today are not popular in all circles, but they are certainly very important, and his work also is characterized by using an enormous amount of data, or what today people like to fashionably refer to as big data, and shows how children's upward income mobility depends crucially on where they grow up. He will also share with us some of the policy lessons that stem from his research and offer some ideas about how we might increase opportunities for upward mobility for low-income children in the future, which I think we would all agree is an important topic. So I would like you to please join me in welcoming Professor Chetty to this year's Snyder Lecture.
Thanks so much for the warm introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So it's a pleasure to be here at Santa Barbara, and it's especially special for me to be here because actually our research team manager, Rebecca Tosland, was a PhD graduate here a few years ago, and she's here in the audience today. So we're both happy to be down here. So I'm going to talk to you about improving equality of opportunity in America, and I'm going to start at a very big picture level to motivate the topic by talking about the American dream, which is a complicated concept that means different things to different people. But let's distill it to a simple statistic that we can measure systematically in the data, which is the probability that a child born to parents in the bottom fifth of the income distribution makes the leap to the top fifth of the income distribution. So the classic Horatio-Alger rags to riches version of the American dream. So how common is that in the United States versus other developed countries around the world where we have comparable data? In the US, as you can see here, 7.5% of children who are born to parents in the bottom quintile make it to the top quintile. That compares with 9% in the United Kingdom, 11.7% in Denmark, and 13.5% in Canada. Now, initially, when people look at these numbers, they sometimes react by saying, oh, even in Canada or in Denmark, it looks like your odds of success aren't all that high, right? Only 13.5% of kids make it to the top 20%. But you have to remember that because you can't have more than 20% of people in the top 20%, the maximum value that this statistic can plausibly take is a rate of 20%. So even though theoretically you could have more than 20% of the kids growing up in low-income families reaching the top, what that would end up requiring is that some kids from higher income families have lower chances of making it to the top than kids from low income families, which we think is very unlikely to occur. And so if you assume that being born to a higher income parent is probably associated with better outcomes, the maximum rate you'd expect to see in an economy with perfect social mobility where your parents play no role at all in determining your outcomes, you'd expect to see 20% of kids make that leap from the bottom to the top. So relative to that 20% kind of max, these are actually quite large differences in rates of upward mobility across countries. One way you might think about it, loosely speaking, is that your chances of achieving the American dream are almost 2 times higher if you're growing up in Canada rather than the United States. Now, these differences across countries have attracted a lot of public attention and have generated a lot of concern that the US may no longer be a land of opportunity contrary to its traditional billing. But what I'm going to focus on here today and what I think we can learn more from in terms of figuring out how to raise upward mobility in the US is that rates of upward mobility vary even more within the United States than they do across countries. In recent work with my colleagues, we calculate upward mobility for every metro and rural area in the US. And this work, as Kelly was mentioning, an important trend in social science is the move towards the use of big data or large administrative data sets. And this work is an example of that. Here, we're using anonymous earnings records on 10 million kids born between 1980 and 1982, drawn from tax and Social Security databases. Think of this as essentially every child born in America in the early 1980s, all right? And we're able to link those kids using tax records to their parents and thereby calculate rates of upward mobility throughout the United States. Now, in what I'm going to show you, in everything we do here, we're going to rank children and parents in the national income distribution and assign kids to locations based on where they grew up. So because people move around, when I say location, think of that as where you grew up, not where you're living in adulthood, all right? So using this data, we construct this map here, which shows you the geography of upward mobility in the United States. So what we're doing here is dividing the US into 740 different metro and rural areas, what are called commuting zones. And in each of those areas, we take the set of kids who grew up in that place and calculate the fraction of those kids who reach the top 20% of the national income distribution. So it's the same statistic that I started out with, conditional on starting in a low-income family in the bottom fifth. What are your odds of making it to the top fifth? And you can see that if you just start by looking at the scale on the right there, there's an incredible amount of variation in rates of upward mobility within America. In the lightest colored places with the highest levels of upward mobility, you have rates of upward mobility that exceed 16.8%, like in the center of the country, for example. That's higher than the numbers we saw for Denmark and for Canada. At the other end of the spectrum, you look at places like Atlanta or Charlotte, North Carolina, and you see numbers around 4.5%, lower than any country for which we currently have data. So even within America, there are some places that are truly lands of opportunity, and there are other places that really look more like lands of persistent chronic poverty. So you can see the broad patterns for yourself. Let me just point out the main features. You tend to have the highest rates of upward mobility in the Great Plains, parts of the West Coast. So for instance, the Bay Area in general has very high rates of upward mobility, comparable to the numbers we saw for Canada, for example. The Southeast has very low levels of upward mobility, and much of the Rust Belt. So if you look at places like Detroit or much of Ohio, you see very low rates of upward mobility. Now in the big map, your eye naturally gravitates to this broad regional variation. But let's now zoom in to the Bay Area. And this map here presents the same data, now at the county level in the Bay Area. And what you can see here is a generic property that we find in this data, which is as you zoom into finer geographies, you continue to find really substantial variation in children's chances of realizing the American dream. So to take an example, if you were growing up in the 1980s in San Francisco, you had a remarkable 18.5% chance of making it from the bottom fifth to the top fifth, very close to that kind of 20% max that I was talking about. In contrast, if you go over the Bay Bridge to Oakland, that number falls by nearly a factor of 2 to 11.4%. So even within relatively narrow geographies, you find substantial differences in children's chances of escaping poverty. Now, naturally, the question that raises is why upward mobility varies so much across places, and what ultimately, from a policy perspective, we might be able to do to increase upward mobility in areas that currently don't offer very good opportunities. So to start from an academic perspective, it's important to note that there are two very different types of explanations for the variation in children's outcomes across areas, which have been the subject of long-standing research in sociology and economics going back at least 30 years to the work of William Julius Wilson and many others. So one possibility is that these differences reflect heterogeneity, that is, different people living in different places. So it's clear that the people who live in Atlanta are very different from the people who live in San Francisco or the people who live in Salt Lake City, another area with very high levels of upward mobility. And so maybe it's not that Salt Lake City or San Francisco generates better outcomes, but just that you have a different demographic mix and a different educational mix, different types of people in different places, and that's what's leading to the variation across areas. If that was what was going on, then the types of policies we'd want to think about would be targeted at people rather than places, right? Even though we see this cross-area variation. The second possibility is that this actually might reflect the causal effect of place, or what's called in the literature neighborhood effects. That is, for a given person, if we put that child in Atlanta instead of San Francisco, or in Oakland instead of a different part of the Bay Area, we would see very different outcomes, right? That is, the place itself actually matters. So it's critical to distinguish between these two explanations, because if it's neighborhood effects, what that suggests is we should be taking a place-based approach possibly to trying to figure out how to improve opportunity in the nation more broadly. So let me talk about how, in the next paper that I'm going to describe, we go about trying to distinguish between these two explanations, which is a challenging thing to do, something that people have been trying to figure out for quite some time. So it's useful to step back and thinking about questions like this and ask, what is the ideal experiment you would run from a scientific perspective if you could run any experiment you want? And in this case, what you'd like to do is randomly assign children to all of the different areas that I was showing you in the maps that I just put up, and compare their outcomes in adulthood, and then you'd be able to definitively tell whether it matters where you grow up, right? Because it's just through random chance if you end up living in one place versus another place in this hypothetical experiment. So naturally, it's very difficult to run an experiment like that in practice. And so what I'm going to show you is a method by which we approximate that experiment using a quasi-experimental design, studying 7 million families who move across areas in observational data, families who move across counties. And the key idea that we're going to exploit here is that we're going to use variation in the age of the child when the family moves in order to identify the causal effects of environment. So I'll show you how that works in a second. But basically, we're just using observational data on families moving across places. And of course, where a family chooses to move is not random by any means and could be correlated with all kinds of characteristics of that family. But what we're going to exploit is not where you choose to move, but essentially when you get there, and in particular, how old your kids are when you get there, which turns out to be a really informative way to look at the data. So rather than going through the statistical details in this lecture and the econometric specification, let me just explain the key result with a simple example, and then I'll talk a little bit about the identification assumptions that are underlying this analysis, okay? So let's imagine a set of families that start out in Oakland, and suppose, just to pick a round number, suppose if you grow up in a low-income family from birth in Oakland, you earn $30,000 on average when we measure your income at age 30. Now let's take a set of families that move from Oakland to San Francisco, which, as we saw in the previous maps that I put up, seems to have better outcomes. So let's say if you grow up from birth in San Francisco, you earn $40,000 on average when we measure your income at age 30. Now what I want to do is take a set of families that move from Oakland to San Francisco with kids of different ages, starting by looking at families who move when their child is exactly 9 years old. So why age 9? That happens to be the earliest age that we can look at in currently available data, all right? So what we see here, what this point shows you, is where the kids who move from Oakland to San Francisco at age 9 end up when we track them forward 21 years and measure their earnings at age 30. And what we see is that these kids end up roughly halfway between the kids who grew up in Oakland from birth and the kids who grew up in San Francisco from birth. That is, they're earning about $35,000. They seem to get about 50% of the gain from growing up in one place versus the other from birth. Okay, so that's for the kids who moved when they're exactly 9 years old. Now let's repeat that analysis, looking at the kids who moved when they're 10, 11, 12, 13, and so on. And what you see is a very clear declining pattern. The later you make that move from Oakland to San Francisco, the less of the gain you get. And if you move by the time you're in your early 20s, you get essentially no gain at all. And if you move after that point, the relationship is just completely flat. So what you see in this chart, I think there are three key takeaways. The first is that this evidence suggests, conditional on a set of assumptions that I'll talk about in a minute, this evidence suggests that these differences that we're seeing about across places are not merely driven by just simple differences in the types of people living in Oakland and the types of people living in San Francisco, because apparently if you take a given child and move that child from Oakland to San Francisco, you see really different outcomes for that child in the long run. So that evidence is consistent with the view that neighborhoods actually matter, and this is not just about heterogeneity and the types of people living in different places. Second, what you can see here is that these differences across places really seem to be due to differences in childhood environment rather than differences in the labor market in adulthood, right? Because if you move when you're an adult, it doesn't seem to do a whole lot in terms of your outcomes. It's really about moving as a kid that seems to affect long-term outcomes, which suggests that these differences across areas, they seem to be predominantly driven by things that are affecting kids as they're growing up. The third important lesson is that this relationship looks roughly linear, right? That is, every extra year of exposure to a better environment has roughly the same impact on kids' long-term outcomes. If you move to a better place at age 10 instead of 11 or 14 instead of 15, it has roughly the same effect. That is an important result, especially in light of current policy discussions about early childhood education, where we think that early childhood intervention can be incredibly valuable, but what these data suggest is there's no reason to kind of give up once kids are 5 years old or something. You continue to see significant benefits to being in a better environment, even at older ages. And so environment matters throughout childhood roughly equally, as far as we can tell from this analysis. Now, all of those conclusions are predicated on a key identifying assumption, which is what makes this as good as an experiment. And this assumption is that the timing of moves to a better or worse area, for instance, moving from Oakland to San Francisco, is uncorrelated with the child's potential outcomes. To put it differently, what we need to be the case, coming back to this chart here, is that the set of families who chose to make this move when their child was 9 has to be comparable to the set of families who chose to move when their child was, say, 15. So what's a potential reason that might not hold? Maybe parents who are particularly concerned about their kids, they recognize that San Francisco might be a better environment than Oakland, and so they move at an earlier age, and that's why you see better outcomes for those kids who move at an earlier age, not because necessarily San Francisco is doing anything for them, but rather because the types of parents who choose to move at earlier ages maybe are more educated or more motivated in some way than the parents who move at older ages, right? So that would contaminate, that kind of thing would contaminate this analysis. So what can we do to evaluate whether we have to worry about such confounds? Let me talk about two things that lead us to believe that this does really reflect the causal effect of place. The first is that we look at siblings within the same family. So we repeat the analysis that I showed you on this chart here, comparing brothers or sisters within the same family. So now imagine a family that moves from Oakland to San Francisco with 2 kids, one of whom is 9 and one of whom is 13. And what you end up finding is that when you compare those kids' outcomes, you get exactly the same relationship. That is, the 9-year-old is doing better than the 13-year-old, exactly in proportion to the 4-year age gap between those 2 kids. So it's really a remarkably robust property, even when you include family fixed effects and compare outcomes within families, you continue to see exactly the same relationship. So that result takes off the table the possibility that this is about different families moving at different times, right? Because we're comparing kids within the same family. There's a separate set of worries you might have, which is that maybe something else is changing in the family at the same time at the point of the move. So maybe you got a better job when you moved to San Francisco, or maybe there was a change in marital status. There was some other shock that maybe led to the move that could also be affecting kids' outcomes. And then again, contaminating the analysis, leading us to misestimate the effect of actually growing up in San Francisco. Now, we do a bunch of things to assess those confounds as well. We can control pretty well for the types of jobs people have, whether they're married or not, and so forth. Let me describe another set of evidence that really, to me, is the most persuasive piece of evidence that shows that places really matter. And this is a set of what we call outcome-based placebo tests that exploit the fact that there's quite a bit of variation in these place effects across subgroups of the population. For instance, there are some places that are particularly good for girls and some places that are particularly good for boys. There's variation across places in different parts of the income distribution. Some places generate a lot of superstars. Other places are good at keeping you out of poverty. There's variation across places over time, across birth cohorts. So there's lots of differences in outcomes across subgroups of the population. And what we find is that there's very precise convergence of kids' outcomes exactly along all of these dimensions. So to take the gender example, suppose you take a family that has a boy and a girl. We find that if they move to a place where boys have particularly high earnings, their son does better in proportion to the number of years in which he grows up in that area, consistent with this figure, but their daughter does not. So you get exactly the effect that you'd expect along gender lines. And if you think about, is there some other confound that would have produced that differential pattern across genders, that just seems a lot less likely than the simpler explanation that where you grow up actually affects your long-term outcome significantly. Okay, so that body of evidence leads us to the view that places really matter here. So next, the importance of place for mobility. Hopefully I've convinced you that where you grow up really matters. So that motivates 2 types of policies. So what do we make of the fact that places matter? What can we now do about it? I think you can think about the problem in 2 ways. One is what I'd call a choice-based approach, which is to give people assistance in moving to better areas. If I know that some places in the US generate better outcomes than others, what if we just simply helped low-income families move to those places? So that's one strategy. A second strategy is what you might call a place-based approach, which is to invest in the low-opportunity places, the darker red-colored places on the maps that I was showing you, in order to replicate the successes of areas like San Francisco in the 1980s, where we see pretty good outcomes for low-income kids. So let me talk about each of these 2 approaches in more detail, starting with the choice-based approach, which another way you can think about it is moving families to opportunity. So one way you might think about implementing such a policy is to give low-income families subsidized housing vouchers to move to better areas. Now, this is not like a radical idea in the sense that in the US, we already spend about $45 billion per year on various affordable housing programs, the largest of which is the Section 8 housing voucher program, which gives families rent assistance, basically, on the order of $8,000 or $10,000 a year to rent an apartment or house wherever they'd like. Now, the problem with this expenditure, in our view, is that most of the affordable housing, if you look at where people with vouchers live or look at where the affordable housing is located, more than 80% of it is in what we would classify based on our data as low opportunity areas. So the program is not actually helping families, despite the vast expenditure. It's not helping families live in places where their kids will succeed. So you might think about trying to deploy this expenditure, more effectively by helping more families move to these higher opportunity, often lower poverty areas. Now, it turns out this idea is something people have thought about in the past, and there's actually a very famous experiment in social science called the Housing and Urban Development Agency's Moving to Opportunity experiment, which many of you will have heard of, which was implemented in the 1990s. And what this experiment did is that it gave vouchers to move to better areas, specifically census tracts with less than a 10% poverty rate, so higher opportunity areas. And it assigned these vouchers using a pure randomized lottery. So this is exactly like a scientific experiment, just a random chance whether you got this voucher or not. And this experiment involved about 5,000 families in 5 large cities around the US and has been extensively studied. And was conducted, as I mentioned, in the mid-1990s. So to give you a concrete sense of what this experiment looked like, let's look at the New York site. So in New York, what they did is they took a bunch of families who were in the Martin Luther King Towers, which is a very big public housing project in Harlem. And some of those families, through this random lottery, were given the chance to move to a lower poverty census tract. And many of those families chose to move to a place called Wakefield in the North Bronx, which is about 10 miles away from Harlem. So you can think of this experiment as essentially asking, suppose by chance you grew up in Harlem versus in Wakefield, what happens to your outcomes in the long run? Now, in a recent paper, we've taken that moving to opportunity data from the 1990s and linked it to tax records so that we can look at the long-term impacts of this experimental intervention. And what we find is really a remarkable set of gains from this relatively simple intervention. So we find that kids who move to these lower poverty areas, Harlem to Wakefield in the example I was giving you, when they were young, that is somewhere below the age of 13, they do much better as adults. They're earning 30% more than the kids in the control group. So that translates to a gain in lifetime earnings of over $100,000. They're 27% more likely to attend college. They're 30% less likely to become single parents. So across a broad spectrum of outcomes, you really see these quite significant improvements from moving to a different place through this housing voucher program. Now, interestingly, moving had little effect on the outcomes of kids who moved at older ages, and it had no effect at all on parents' earnings. Now, these two facts, if you look at this combination of evidence that I have on the slide, this exactly matches that declining slope pattern that I put up earlier. It shows you that you've really got to move to a better place at a younger age in order to get big gains. That is, exposure to a better neighborhood during childhood is what matters most. So it reinforces that conclusion. It also explains, some of you might be aware that there's been a long literature studying this moving to opportunity experiment over the past 20 years, and it's largely been a very disappointing literature in the sense that people have found very little effect of this experiment on people's outcomes. But most of that work focused on the outcomes of adults or kids who moved at older ages, because those were the only people who were old enough for whom you could measure earnings and things like that. The key thing here is if you look at the kids who move when they're very young and track them for 20 plus years, you start to see some really big gains. And so it, again, reinforces the view that childhood is really crucial in thinking about these place effects. So furthermore, I think what the Moving to Opportunity experiment demonstrates is that a policy of subsidized housing vouchers that is carefully targeted, that helps families move to these higher opportunity areas, can really dramatically reduce intergenerational poverty. And so that, I think, is actually a tool that the government could potentially implement, and possibly implement at scale. There are about 2 million families in the US currently receiving vouchers. And so I think, while it can't be the only solution, I think this kind of moving to opportunity approach could be quite valuable. Now, people often have a number of concerns about this idea of moving families to opportunity. And so let me raise here what I think are the 3 most common concerns that are often raised about the moving to opportunity approach. The first is a concern about costs. So just, is this approach fine? You were able to do a small experiment with 5,000 families, and see some significant gains, is it too expensive to be scaled up from the government's perspective? And especially in, in the current time where people are talking about cutting budgets as much as possible, is it really plausible that we could implement a policy like this? So the thing that I'd note here in terms of thinking about costs is that at least from a long-run perspective, this is actually likely to be a cost-saving program for the government, because we find that the increase in tax revenue from the children's higher earnings, so these kids are doing better in adulthood, right? And so they're paying more taxes, just mechanically, they're paying more taxes back to the government. That increase in tax revenue more than offsets the incremental cost of the voucher program relative to public housing. So the program just kind of, without even doing anything, automatically pays for itself, setting aside the gains that the kids get, just purely from the government's fiscal perspective. The cost, we think, of the voucher program relative to public housing is actually negative. So I don't think, at least in a long-run planning sense, that costs are a key barrier here. A second very common concern is that, okay, so we're going to help some families move to better areas, and maybe that'll help their kids, but isn't that going to destabilize the neighborhoods they left behind even further? Because there are going to be lots of people who aren't able to move from Harlem to Wakefield, and so isn't that going to be, it seems potentially a bad thing to uproot a bunch of families that are stably ensconced in a given place and have them move somewhere else. That seems like it would destabilize communities. So here, I think that's a totally legitimate concern. What I'd note is that you shouldn't think about the places where low-income families live as just fixed over time, and think of this voucher program as coming and uprooting a family and having them move somewhere else. Rather, something like 1 in 5 low-income families already moves in any given year. And so the way I think about these programs is that they redirect the flows. When you're thinking about moving, maybe you'd think about moving to a place that's higher opportunity in light of these findings and in light of such a program relative to where you otherwise might have considered. And we are currently working with HUD to implement pilots exactly along those lines, thinking about helping families who are thinking about moving already move to areas that might be better for their kids. The third concern, which I actually think is probably the most important one from a political perspective, is that higher income people often have the concern that if you try to integrate neighborhoods by helping low-income people move to these higher opportunity areas, that sure, that might help their kids, but it might come at the expense of the kids in higher income families. Maybe there are going to be negative effects on the kids in middle class and higher income families who are living in these places to which the low-income families are moving. So this is a difficult question to get at empirically. What I can tell you, though, is in our data, we're able to estimate not just the effects of places on low-income kids, what I was showing you here, but also in the maps earlier, but we can also analogously estimate the effects of places on high-income kids' outcomes, right? And we find that if anything, if you look at mixed income neighborhoods where you have the poor and rich living together rather than living apart, you find that if anything, the outcomes of the rich kids look slightly better in those places. So there doesn't seem to be clear evidence in the data of a really hard trade-off, like a zero-sum game, where as you have a setting where the poor are doing better, the higher income kids are doing worse. So I think, nevertheless, this is likely to be an important political constraint in moving forward with this type of policy. But my best sense, given currently available data, is that empirically it's not actually as much of a concern as you might think. Okay, so all that's to say, we think the moving to opportunity approach is at least one policy that we have in hand that demonstrably, clearly could make a difference in these issues. Now, that said, there's a limit to the scalability of such policies, right? You're never going to be able to move everybody out of Harlem to a different part of New York. You're never going to move everyone out of Atlanta. That kind of policy just doesn't make sense on scale. So you also have to think about policies that can improve existing neighborhoods. And the first step, I think, in understanding such policies in identifying such policies is to understand the characteristics of areas that currently have high levels of upward mobility. So ultimately, what we'd like to be able to do is offer a recipe to, say, local policymakers in Atlanta, like, here are 6 things you need to do in order to improve rates of upward mobility in your city, right? So we're not there yet, and I hope with additional research we'll be able to figure that out. But as a first step, what I'll be able to tell you is, here are the types of things that seem to happen in places that have high rates of upward mobility from a correlational perspective. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to summarize. We've looked at a variety of different factors that sociologists and economists have thought about over the years. I'm going to summarize the 5 strongest correlations that we find in the data. The first is segregation. We find that places that are more residentially segregated by race or by income tend to have much lower levels of upward mobility. Now, there are many different methods that you can use to measure segregation from a statistical perspective. Turns out that the exact measure you use is not that important here because the patterns are so stark that you can just see them visually. So let me give you a couple of examples. This map here depicts racial segregation in Atlanta. The way it's constructed using census data is that each person in Atlanta is represented by a dot, and the dots are colored so that whites are blue, blacks are green, Asians are red, and Hispanics are orange. And you can see immediately, no matter how you measure it, it's completely clear that Atlanta is an incredibly segregated city, right? The green dots are just in a completely separate part of the city relative to the blue dots. Corresponding to that, Atlanta and places that look like it in terms of residential segregation tend to have the lowest levels of upward mobility in our data. Now, why might that be? It could be a story about role models and peer effects and networks. So, if you live in a city like this, you're probably not coming into contact with people from different racial or ethnic backgrounds, with higher income people, and maybe that affects your aspirations or your networks or the information you have. Maybe that ends up negatively affecting kids' outcomes. Or perhaps it's a story about resources. When you're in a city like this, the public school funding for kids in lower income families or black families is going to tend to be much lower than when you're in a city that's more integrated, where you have lower and higher income people going to the same school, just because of the way that schools are funded using local tax base. So we don't know exactly what the mechanism is that's driving this correlation. We're trying to figure that out in our ongoing research. But what we can say is there's a very strong pattern that cities that look like this tend to have very low levels of upward mobility, especially when compared with, say, a city like Sacramento, which actually has the same minority share as Atlanta, the same fraction of blacks and Hispanics as Atlanta. But you can see immediately that Sacramento is a much more integrated city than Atlanta, right? It's not perfectly integrated, but the colors are much more interspersed than they were in Atlanta. And corresponding to that, places that look like this in terms of residential structure tend to have much higher rates of upward mobility. So that's the first key pattern in the data, that segregation seems to have a strong link with rates of intergenerational mobility. The second factor we identify is income inequality. So places with a smaller middle class tend to have much lower levels of upward mobility. So if you have fewer people, say, between the 25th and 75th percentile of the national income distribution, you tend to have less mobility across generations as well. Insofar as this link reflects a causal pathway, it suggests that there might be a link between inequality and intergenerational mobility, which I think is potentially concerning because, as you all know, income inequality is growing rapidly in the United States. And this kind of relationship suggests that that might also mean that equality of opportunity or intergenerational poverty might get worse as well going forward. So at least something to be potentially concerned about. So the third and fourth factors I'm going to talk about come more from the sociology literature than the economics literature. We find that places with more stable family structures tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. So one way to measure that, we see that areas with more single parents tend to have lower levels of mobility. This actually, interestingly, turns out to be the single strongest correlation in the data. Just the univariate correlation between the fraction of single parents and rates of upward mobility is more than 0.7. So you explain a lot of the variation across areas just by the fraction of single parents. Now, in interpreting that correlation, it's very important to note that this is not simply driven by the fact that kids who grow up in one-parent families have worse outcomes than kids who grow up in two-parent families. So that is true to some extent, but the way you can see that that is not what's driving the relationship that I'm pointing out here across areas is that if we look at the subset of kids whose own parents are married, so say you grow up in a two-parent household, but you live in an area with a lot of single parents, you are less likely to climb the income ladder. So it's not literally about whether your own parents are married or not. It's, again, something about community level factors, the nature of what's going on in your area. For some reason, the fraction of single parents in your area is very highly correlated with rates of upward mobility, maybe reflecting something about stability or other factors that happen to be correlated with the fraction of single parents. Again, it's hard to say exactly what the mechanism is. The fourth factor is somewhat related to that. It's the idea of social capital. So the way I think about social capital is the old adage that it takes a village to raise a child. So the idea of social capital is, will someone else help you out even if you're not doing well? Salt Lake City with the Mormon Church is thought to be a classic example of a place with a lot of social capital, and corresponding to that, Salt Lake City is one of the highest levels of upward mobility in our data. Now, this concept of social capital was popularized by Bob Putnam at Harvard in a book some of you might know, a famous book called Bowling Alone. And the reason for the title of Bob's book is that social capital is a notoriously hard thing to measure. And Bob used the number of bowling alleys, and in particular whether people were bowling alone, as a proxy for social capital. So I was amazed to find in our own data, the reason I mentioned that here, I was amazed to find in our own data that the number of bowling alleys is actually incredibly highly correlated with these differences in upward mobility across places that I've been showing you. So Bob was onto something. But the reason I mentioned that here is I think that also nicely illustrates a key caveat to everything I'm showing you on this slide, which is that these are correlations rather than causal effects, right? That is, I would be surprised if the policy lesson you should take from this is that we should build more bowling alleys to increase upward mobility in the United States. So the way you want to think about all of these factors is not that they tell you exactly what you need to do in order to improve outcomes, but rather that they give you a sense of what kinds of factors seem to be correlated and maybe where we should be studying mechanisms further. The fifth factor, quality of education, perhaps not surprisingly, the quality of education in an area, both at the primary, the K through 12 level, and the secondary level, seems to be very highly correlated with these differences in mobility. That fifth factor, I think, is a little bit different from the other four because there's a lot of research, including from people here at UCSB and many other places, showing that the quality of education has substantial causal effects on kids' long-term outcomes. So here, I think we're quite confident from other research, some of which I'll show you a little bit from our own research group in a second. We're quite confident that unlike these other factors, this is not merely correlation. We think that there are significant causal pathways here, right? So I'm now going to turn to that and spend the rest of the lecture focusing on the education angle a little bit more. Not because I think it's necessarily the most important on this list. I think the other factors are also extremely important. It's just the area where both our team and others more broadly have made the most progress in thinking about mechanisms and causal effects. And I hope we'll be able to do analogous analysis for the other factors as well. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're trying to do that at the end. So I'm going to show you a little bit of evidence on education policy, both at the K through 12 level and at the higher education level. And so let me start with the K through 12 work, drawing on some work with John Friedman and Jonah Rokoff from a different study, where here we're using big data to study teachers' impacts. And so what we do in this study is take data for all kids who went to New York City public schools between 1989 and 2009, so that's 2.5 million kids, who wrote 18 million tests over that period. And we take that data and link it to the tax records that I've been showing you results from in the past few slides. And by linking those two data sets, you're able to ask a question like, how does the quality of your third grade teacher affect how much you're earning at age 30, what college you attend, whether you had a teenage birth, and so forth. So you can look at the impacts of teachers and quality of education more broadly early in childhood on outcomes much, much later. So in order to do that analysis, the first thing you have to do is have some measure of teacher quality, right? So if I want to be able to show you that higher quality teachers seem to have long-term benefits, we need to have some way to measure teacher quality to begin with. Now, one prominent measure that many of you might have heard of that's being discussed in policy circles and in the academic debate at the moment is what are known as teacher value-added measures. While there are a number of statistical issues in the background in constructing these measures, the fundamental concept is really very simple in a value-added measure. The question is simply how much a teacher raises his or her students' test scores on average. So for instance, if I'm a 4th grade teacher, we'd calculate my value added by taking my students' test scores on average at the end of 4th grade minus their test scores on average at the beginning of 4th grade. And if that number is very positive, we'd say I'm a high value added teacher. And if it's very negative, we'd say I'm a low value added teacher, right? So it's essentially that simple concept. Now, again, it's useful to step back and ask, what is the ideal experiment you would run in order to figure out whether being assigned to a high value added teacher has significant effects on kids' long-term outcomes and on intergenerational mobility and so forth. And so in this context, the ideal experiment would be to rate a bunch of teachers on their value added based on historical test score data, and then take a new batch of kids and tell their parents, look, we've identified some teachers in this school as being low value added and some as high value added. We want to figure out this really important policy question of whether teacher value added matters for kids' long-term outcomes. So we're going to randomly assign some of your kids to teachers who are low value added and some as high value added, and let's see how they do in 25 years. And you can imagine, again, running that experiment is not really practical. And so what I want to show you is, thanks to the power of modern data sets, we can essentially approximate that experiment with existing data. You can essentially find that experiment data we already have without having to actually run it. So let me again illustrate that with a simple example. So what we're going to exploit is the fact that there's a lot of turnover in school districts across school years. So there are some years where a teacher might go on maternity leave or switch to a different grade. And so just essentially by random chance from the student's perspective, you may end up with a different mix of teachers in one year versus another year, okay? So to operationalize that, let's imagine tracking a given school in New York City across school years. So kids who show up, say in 4th grade in 1993, 1994, 1995, so these are different cohorts of kids. And we're going to track these kids over time. So what you see is, the test scores, average test scores, are just bouncing around the median in the school. Now, what happens at the end of the 1995 school year is that a new teacher comes in who's rated in the top 5% of the value-added distribution based on historical data. And let's look at what happens to test scores when that teacher comes in. You see that the kids' test scores immediately jump up, and they continue to stay high as she teaches subsequent cohorts of children, right? So you see clearly that there's a significant change in the amount that students are learning as measured by standardized tests when this teacher who we thought might be of higher quality starts to teach these children. Now, in any experiment like this, we all know that you want to have a treatment group where something changes. So in this case, the better teacher entering in 4th grade. But you also want to have a control group to make sure nothing else changed at the same time, of course, right? So we want to make sure, for instance, that the school wasn't more generally just becoming better because the principal had more resources or something like that. So in this context, in the context of this large change in teacher quality, there's a natural control group, which is to look at 3rd graders. And the idea is, if the better teacher came in 4th grade, she shouldn't have had any impact on 3rd grade outcomes, right? And in fact, when you look at 3rd grade outcomes, they're totally flat around this point where the better teacher enters 4th grade. So that kind of evidence, even though we can't run the ideal experiment I was describing to you, that kind of evidence, this data is coming from averaging over thousands of such events in this big data set. It's essentially, we think, as compelling as being able to run a randomized experiment. It's pretty clear that the teacher has a causal effect on the amount that kids are learning. So I've emphasized here the upper tail, the effects of a really good teacher coming in. I should note that this is totally symmetric in the opposite direction. If you have this teacher who's in the bottom 5% of the value-added distribution, doesn't want to be there, coming in and starting to teach students, he immediately pulls down students' test scores relative to the prior grade. So it's completely symmetric across the distribution, right? High value-added teachers raise your test scores, low value-added teachers reduce your test scores. Now, all that just shows you that teachers seem to have causal effects on how well students do on standardized tests. But ultimately, what we care about, coming back to the discussion of upward mobility, is not how well people are doing on standardized tests. We care about long-term outcomes like earnings and college attendance and teenage birth rates and things like that. So we replicate exactly the kind of analysis based on teachers switching in and out that I've been showing you here, using those long-term outcomes measured in the tax data. And let me just summarize what we find rather than going through each result. Let me summarize what we find with this example here. So let's imagine a hypothetical policy exercise where we take the bell curve of teacher quality, and let's say we identify the teachers who are in the bottom 5% of the value-added distribution, estimated in the way that I described earlier. And suppose we implement a policy that either replaces these teachers with teachers of average quality or gives them some training that brings them to the average quality level. So that, in principle, should be a feasible thing that we can do in American school districts, right? What are the effects of such an intervention? Our estimates, using exactly the type of data that I was describing here, imply that that change for a single year would raise the lifetime earnings of a given child by $50,000 on average. So for a single year, if you had a teacher of average quality instead of a teacher in the bottom 5% of the distribution, that adds up to $1.4 million for a classroom of average size in America, about 28 students. That is worth, if you want to look at this as an investment, it's worth about $250,000 in present value, discounting at a 5% interest rate, which is a far too high interest rate at the moment. So the point here is that this seems incredibly valuable in terms of potentially changing kids' long-term outcomes in a meaningful way, and shows you concretely that education at the elementary level can really make a significant difference. Now, the last set of results I want to show you from our most recent study, which is looking at higher education. And here we have less to say on causal effects, but I think a set of data that hopefully will be of particular interest to you here at UC Santa Barbara. So many people, as you know, think of pathways to upward mobility as going through higher education, right? You go to college in order to have better life chances, get a better job, and so forth. However, inequality in access to colleges, if only the richest kids can go to the best colleges in America, inequality in access to colleges could actually limit the effect of colleges on upward mobility significantly, or even reverse the effect. Suppose you were in a world where only the rich get to go to the colleges that are the best, then colleges could actually exacerbate intergenerational inequality rather than reducing it. Now, people have been very interested in understanding the effects of colleges on economic outcomes for a long time, but there have been significant data limitations in what we can actually say at the college level. So usually when people estimate the returns to education, it's about the total number of years that you spend in college, not about which particular college you attended, because it's typically very hard to get data on the outcomes of kids at all colleges in the US. So in this paper that we just put out a couple of months ago, we construct publicly available, what we're calling mobility report cards for every college in America in order to characterize the role of colleges in mobility. And the way we're doing this is using attendance and income data on all college students in America from 1999 to 2013, obtained from the Treasury, from tax records, and from the Department of Education. And so to give you a sense of that data, let me start with what the picture looks like in my own university, Stanford. So this chart here plots the income distribution of parents of Stanford students by quintile. So you can see that at Stanford, 3.6% of the students at Stanford come from the bottom quintile. 69% of students come from the top quintile. Moreover, 14.5% of students come from the top 1%. So that's an income of more than $550,000 a year, right? So what's striking about this is that at Stanford and at all of the other kind of comparable Ivy League type colleges, there are more students from the top 1% of the income distribution than the entire bottom half of the income distribution. So access to colleges like Stanford and Harvard and so forth is incredibly skewed to the very upper tail of the income distribution. Another way that you can look at this is that your probability of attending an Ivy plus college is 77 times higher if you happen to have parents in the top 1% relative to if you happen to be born to parents in the bottom quintile of the income distribution. So 77-fold difference is, obviously quite a substantial difference in access. Now, that's in thinking about intergenerational mobility, that's part of the picture, right? So that shows you what parents' incomes look like. So now you also want to think about what the kids' outcomes look like. So this chart here, the bars are the same as before. Now what we're introducing in the line is data on children's outcomes. And what those dots are showing you is the fraction of students who reach the top quintile of the income distribution. So the same measure that I was talking about in the first slide. What fraction of kids make it to the top fifth, right? And this is showing you what that looks like across kids from different parent income quintiles. So for the kids from low income families and the kids from high income families. So there's an interesting pattern here, which is the kids from low income families and the kids from high income families do just about as well as each other at Stanford. There's no evidence that kids from lower income families do any worse than the kids from high income families. And that's an important result because it suggests that there's very little mismatch of children from low socioeconomic status backgrounds, conditional on getting in, of course, at these elite colleges, right? It's not like if you came from a low income family, you're just not able to keep up with the kids from higher income families. You actually seem to do perfectly well and have exactly the same outcome. So that, I think, is actually encouraging news because it suggests that colleges like Stanford could potentially, maybe admit more low-income kids and end up producing pretty good outcomes for them. It's not like those kids end up struggling when they come to a place like Stanford. So now let's look at the data for Santa Barbara, which is shown here in blue. And so what I think is interesting here is when you look at the UC schools, Santa Barbara, Berkeley, and a number of others, the outcomes look slightly below what you see at Stanford and Harvard, the schools that have the very highest outcomes, but they're not all that different. So, roughly 50% of kids at Santa Barbara make it to the top quintile, compared with 60% at Stanford. And again, it looks roughly flat across the income distribution. What we were expecting going into this project is that places like Santa Barbara and Berkeley and so forth would really be the biggest engines of mobility in the US because we thought they would take the most low-income kids and help them reach upper income quintiles. And so that story turns out only to be half true in the sense that the outcomes at places like UCSB look very good. But actually, when you look at the income distribution of the parents at UCSB, there are fewer high-income parents than there are at Stanford. But it's not like there's an enormous number of very low-income kids at places like Santa Barbara, same thing at UCLA, UC Berkeley, and so forth. It's somewhat higher than at Stanford, but it's nowhere close to 20%, for instance. So what are the colleges in America where you see lots of low-income kids who end up doing quite well? In order to get at that, and rather than showing you this kind of chart for all of the 2,500 colleges to kind of condense the data and make the presentation a little more efficient, I'm going to focus on two statistics. The first is what I'm going to call access, which is the fraction of kids who come from families in the bottom quintile. At Santa Barbara, that's 6.2% of children. And then I'm going to look at the success rate, which is your odds of reaching the top fifth conditional on starting in the bottom fifth. So the statistic we started out on the very first slide. And at Santa Barbara, that's 50%, right? So that looks very good at Santa Barbara. Access looks relatively low. So now putting these two things together, the access and success rate measures, we can define what we call a college's mobility rate, which is the fraction of students who start out in a poor family in the bottom quintile and end up in the top quintile. So technically, what is this? This is the joint probability of the parent being in the bottom quintile and the kid being in the top quintile, right? So an identity is that this mobility rate is the product of access and the success rate. So for instance, at Santa Barbara, 6% of kids are from the bottom quintile, and about half of them make it to the top quintile, right? So that means that if you take 100 students, 100 undergrads at Santa Barbara, 3 out of those 100 would come from a low-income family and end up being high income, end up being in the top quintile, right? So that mobility rate provides a simple statistic to measure, in an accounting sense, the contribution of each college in terms of moving kids from the bottom to the top of the income distribution, okay? So the number at Santa Barbara is 3%. So let's now ask, we can do this calculation at all colleges in the US. And so what are the colleges in America that have the highest mobility rates, that are moving the most kids from low-income families to high-income families? So these are the top 10 colleges in America by mobility rate. And I think you see some interesting patterns here. So the number 1 college is Cal State LA. And so why does Cal State LA end up at the top? That's because Cal State LA has pretty good outcomes. I think it's something like a 35% success rate. Not as good as Santa Barbara, but pretty good. But it has 6 times as many low-income kids as Santa Barbara. So the base of low-income kids you're working with at a place like Cal State LA is just much larger. And as a result, Cal State LA has a remarkable mobility rate of 9.9%. So nearly 1 in 10 kids at Cal State LA is coming from a poor family and ending up relatively rich. Other places that have very high mobility rates include Stony Brook. The City University of New York in general has very high mobility rates across all of its campuses. Glendale Community College is a community college in Los Angeles. Cal State Poly, University of Texas El Paso. These are the places that end up at the top of the list. Santa Barbara, we talked about, is at 3%. Stanford's at 2.2%. When I was talking to admissions officials at Stanford who were not particularly pleased to see Stanford at the bottom of this list, they were wondering, why does Stanford have such a low mobility rate? Well, I mean, obviously, if you have no low-income kids, it's hard to move a lot of them from the bottom to the top, right? So Stanford has terrific outcomes, the very best outcomes, actually, of any college in the US, but you're going to end up with a low mobility rate if you just don't have access for lower-income kids. So I want to show one final slide on this, which gives you a sense of how these things are changing over time, and I think raises some important policy issues. So as many of you might know, over the past 15 years, there have been lots of concerns about access to education, to higher education institutions. And as a result of that, some colleges like Harvard and Stanford, a number of elite private colleges, have essentially made college free for kids, for low-income kids and even for middle-class kids, right? And so you can ask, what have those policy changes done in terms of access? What fraction of parents are in the bottom quintile? And here I'm plotting the data for Harvard. And you can see that at Harvard, they essentially made college free for families earning below $80,000 in 2006. And you can see that there's some uptick in the fraction of kids below, from the bottom 20%. You could do a similar analysis looking at the bottom 60%. See very similar patterns. So maybe a little bit of an increase, but nothing dramatic. At Stanford, it's just completely flat, even after you change tuition policies. So as far as we can tell, these cuts don't seem to have dramatic effects on changing access. What is a much bigger trend, and the reason I'm showing this to you here, what I think is much more worrisome, is if you look at the highest mobility rate colleges in our data, these kind of mid-tier public institutions like the Cal States, Glendale Community College, and so forth, you see very steadily declining access at those institutions. So for instance, Stony Brook was one of the places that had quite high access and very good outcomes, very high mobility rate, had almost twice as many low-income kids as a share of its students in 2000 as it does today. Glendale Community College, similarly, steep downward trend. Santa Barbara is roughly constant, right? So what we see here is that the state kind of flagship type institutions, they haven't changed all that much, but the colleges that really seem to have the highest mobility rates in terms of taking low-income kids and having a lot of them reach the top of the ladder, those are the mid-tier schools, not the state flagship schools. And perhaps because of budget cuts or tuition increases or a variety of other factors that remain to be understood and explored, access to those institutions has been falling significantly. And I think that, again, is a very worrying sign in terms of upward mobility in the US, because insofar as higher education is a pathway to upward mobility, falling access to these places that offer ladders up is clearly not a good thing. So let me conclude by talking about some broader policy lessons and give you a sense of where we are headed in our research group in terms of future work. So the first broad message that I think emerges from this research is that we should be thinking about addressing inequality by improving opportunity at a local and not just a national level. So even when you just think of the term the American dream, usually what comes to mind is a national question of federal policy changes and so forth. But my take from looking at these data is that it's really much more of a local issue. And I think that's actually encouraging in the context of the current political environment, because there's probably more we can do in local communities given the gridlock in DC. And so concretely, what does that mean? I think targeting areas that currently offer less opportunity, places like Oakland or Atlanta, makes a lot of sense. I actually think you want to zoom in finer than that. So what we're doing in our current work is geocoding the full population in order to map opportunity by zip code and by census tract in every area of the US in order to identify what we're calling opportunity bargains. And so let me give you just a preliminary sense of how that looks. So this chart here illustrates what we're calling opportunity bargains at the zip code level in the New York metro area. And so what it's plotting is on the y-axis is an opportunity index. So our estimate of what the causal effect of growing up in each of these zip codes will be on kids' earnings in adulthood. So for instance, at the bottom, you see the Martin Luther King Towers, where we estimate that if you grow up there, you're going to earn 20% less than if you grew up in the average place in the US. And then at the top, you see places like Park Slope. Park Slope, some of you might know, is where Bill de Blasio used to live before he became mayor. And you see quite good outcomes in Park Slope. Now, the concern you might have is that moving to a higher opportunity area might be very expensive, right? You might think that in order to be able to buy opportunity for your kids, you're going to have to pay a lot in terms of higher rent. And so that's indeed the case in Park Slope. And more generally, you see a positive relationship here. We're plotting the opportunity index versus rents, monthly rents. And so places like Park Slope are they're more expensive. But the key thing to note is that you can get almost the same amount of opportunity as you see in Park Slope if you go to a place like East Midwood or Rockaway Park, other parts of New York, which are half as expensive. And so that's what we're calling an opportunity bargain, a place where kids, low-income kids, apparently do quite well, yet it's not completely unaffordable for a low-income family. And so we're working with HUD to try to figure out whether we can help more voucher holders move to these areas, and more generally figure out what those places are doing so that we can replicate their successes elsewhere. The second broad theme that I think emerges is that we should focus on childhood environments. Usually discussions of inequality focus on the labor market and trade and other issues that I think are extremely important. But what these data show you is that childhood conditions matter quite a bit as well. Here, I would emphasize that it's not just about spending more money. So usually, when we talk about problems like this, the discussion ends up revolving around the amount of resources we allocate to higher education or to public schools and so forth. At a big picture level, the US already spends more on K through 12 education than many other countries, like Scandinavian countries, that have much better outcomes. So that itself suggests that it's not just about dollars. I think it's about how those dollars are spent. And so I think it's very important, like I was showing you with the college data, to figure out how you can identify and increase access to high-performing colleges in particular, and go further with the data that I was showing you on colleges, which doesn't tell you the causal effect of each college. Try to identify, what's the causal effect of attending Cal State LA versus some other school. If the causal effect is really positive, how can we get more kids to attend Cal State LA or replicate that model elsewhere, and so forth. Third, as I've looked at this data, my sense is beyond the traditional factors that we usually think about, schools and resource policy type changes that are in the traditional domain of economists, my sense is that looking at the patterns with segregation and other related data, things like social norms and aspirations seem extremely important. So, why are low-income kids not doing so well in certain communities? I think it's not just about the quality of schools and the resources they have, but also about who they're around. Do you have somebody who shows you a pathway to attending college, or you can see yourself in their shoes doing their career? I think in very segregated cities, you often don't have that. And so I think an interesting and important question we're trying to explore is how we can create more connected communities. So as an example, we're studying how networks affect poverty and well-being across areas now in a collaboration with Facebook, where you have very rich data on networks and can get at issues of social capital and peer effects and aspirations much, much more precisely than was previously feasible. And then finally, at the broadest level, as I hope I've showed you here, I think harnessing big data to develop a scientific evidence base for economic and social policy is both feasible and I think extremely valuable. All of the data that I've been showing you here in this lecture on upward mobility, on the colleges, all of the other statistics are publicly available on this website, equalityofopportunity.org. And our hope is that many of you and others will be interested in using these data to study the effect of local interventions, monitor trends in mobility, and study which policies work. So let me end with this chart here, which I think gives you a sense of why I think this is a particularly important moment in America to think about these issues. So what this chart plots is a notion of the American dream that people have thought about traditionally, which is the fraction of kids who are doing better than their parents at the same age. What fraction of kids are earning more than their parents by the year in which the child was born, by the child's birth cohort? You can see that for kids born in 1940 in America, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to do better than your parents. More than a 90% chance that you were going to earn more than your parents did at age 35 or so. That guarantee has greatly eroded over the past half century or so, such that for kids entering the labor force today, kids born in the 1980s, it's essentially a coin flip as to whether you're going to achieve the American dream of doing better than your parents. And I think this trend has a lot to do with the frustration that many people are feeling around the US. And I think figuring out how to reverse this trend is one of the defining challenges of our time. Thanks.
Sneak in here to this microphone and say that if people have a few questions, we have 15 minutes or so, and Anne has a microphone. So if you raise your hand, she will happily come and give you a microphone.
So when I saw your initial map of the United States come up, I'm sure you've looked at this, but I just didn't hear it in your lecture, is that basically just the center of the country is the whitest part of the country. And then, so you have these things about segregation, and I wonder if you looked at it, is it segregation or is it the percent of white?
Yeah.
Are the people that moved, were they whiter?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it kept coming up
Yep,
for me. So
absolutely. So as you noticed in that initial map, another very strong correlate is racial demographics, right? So clearly the areas with larger black populations have much lower levels of upward mobility. So let me say a couple of things on that. So first, we're not able to see race yet at the individual level in the data that we're using because you don't see race in tax records. So we're trying to figure out how to work around that problem. However, because there's so much segregation, you can predict race pretty well based on zip code or census tract. And so what we're able to see is that even in the white parts of Atlanta, for people who we're pretty certain are white, low-income whites in Atlanta have much lower rates of upward mobility than low-income whites in other parts of the country. So as best we can do it at the moment, if we restrict attention to people who we're pretty confident are white, the map looks very similar. So our sense is this is not just that black people have different rates of upward mobility than whites. It's correlated with the fraction black at the area level, but both the whites and the blacks in areas with large black populations have lower rates of upward mobility. So race matters, but in a much more complicated way than just at the individual level, right? And so, why might that be? The historical legacy of segregation and kind of racial discrimination in the US is that places with larger black populations tend to be more segregated and tend to have less investment in public goods, and that could equally well affect the whites and the blacks. So we think something like that is going on. We're trying to dig into that further once we get individual level race data.
Curious whether you looked at other characteristics of schools. It's nice to have a good teacher.
Yeah.
What else can schools do to improve
Yeah,
upward
so
mobility?
class size, there's evidence, as you know, on various other aspects of schools that matter, resources, to some extent, which affect all of these things. In a correlational sense, you don't have great data, across areas in the US that on measures of school quality, but as best we can tell, if we use measures of expenditure per student, class size, all of those are pretty highly correlated, with these differences in mobility across areas. And as you know from other quasi-experimental studies and experimental studies like the STAR experiment, we have decent evidence that things like class size matter as well. I focus on teachers partly because my sense is that's where you see maybe the clearest returns. The class size evidence, I think it's not totally clear. There's some contexts you find pretty significant gains, other contexts you find smaller gains.
I'm wondering if this presentation has been given to, say, congressmen in Washington, and if so, what kind of reaction have you gotten?
Yeah, so many times. I've actually talked to Bernie Sanders earlier this week, and which may not be the most relevant thing at the moment, but Paul Ryan, number of others, and the key thing. So inequality is often a divisive topic with different people having different views. The impression I get is when you talk about equality of opportunity, there tends to be much more support on both sides of the aisle for trying to figure out how we can give everyone an equal chance of succeeding. So while if you're talking about redistribution of income, equality of outcomes, some people feel like we need to have more redistribution, and others feel like if you earned a lot of money, you're entitled to keep it, and the government should stay out of the business of taking it away from you. I think people have different views on that. But when you talk about equality of opportunity, you don't, I think for the most part, come across anyone who says, just because you happen to be born to a poor family or happen to be born in this area instead of that area, you should have access to different schools or different opportunities to climb the income ladder. And so I actually think in thinking about these issues of inequality, the opportunity lens can be a way to bring people together and potentially make progress on the policy front. And so we've been finding quite a bit of interest, both from Ben Carson now at HUD, who have spoken with quite a bit, and people in the previous administration who also are interested in these issues. So it's the rare topic where I think there is actually bipartisan interest, and in particular, because you can do a lot of this at the local level, we're trying to work at the moment to set up a more systematic network with local policymakers to try to deploy this type of evidence and get local officials to make changes in light of these data.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Lars Chetty.